Hello everyone, it's SpawnPoiint and welcome back to another video. And today I'm going to be taking you on a 1,000 mile road trip in my Tesla Model 3. So if you're wondering how easy it is to use an electric car for a road trip, how long it will take and how much it will cost, stick with me. So I'm going to be going over how I prepped, planned and completed this 1,000 mile road trip last week. We had some interesting stops along the way and we even made a new friend. So I live in York and I'll be driving to Carbis Bay in Cornwall. So it's 400 miles each way, which for the UK is quite a big distance to cover in one direction. So I've driven the same route more than 20 times over the years, but this is the first time that I'll be doing it in an electric car. I'll be travelling with my wife and 2 children, so the car will be fully loaded with luggage, toys, wetsuits and all my important camera gear and tech items, just in case. So the first thing that you need to think about when you're taking a Tesla or any electric car on a road trip is the prep before you leave. Now some of these will apply to non-electric cars too. Now, the Model 3 has a great boot space. It's actually pretty big, and I had no issues at all packing the car with everything that we wanted to take. Plus, you've got the compartment under the boot floor, which is huge as well. And then you've got the front space too, which is actually where I'm storing the charging cables. I'll explain why I'll do this a little bit later. Okay, so that's the boot fully packed. Not sure I could fit much else in here, even if I tried. I also always check my tyres before a long trip. This might need adjusting to accommodate the extra weight too, so your tyre pressures may need increasing. So on a day-to-day basis, I usually charge my car to 80%, as it's rare that I need any more than that. But for this trip, I will be charging to 100%. So I've plugged it in the night before to make sure that there's no reason that I won't be ready for the next day. Now, as I know what time I will be leaving in the morning, I've actually set the car to precondition. And this will begin to warm the battery and prepare the car for about 20 minutes before I need it. Now this is the most efficient way to start your trip, as you're not wasting 30 minutes of your actual trip getting the car and battery up to its optimum efficiency. So while it's warming, you will definitely hear it. So just take a listen to this. So I mentioned that I store my 2 charging cables in the front. That's the 3-pin plug and the Type 2 cable. Although most people store theirs in the compartment under the boot floor. Now the reason I do this is I rarely, in fact never, use the front to store anything else in, but I do use the boot, which means it's often covering the compartment that I need to lift up. And while I'm on this road trip, the boot will be rammed, so I won't be able to grab the cable from the boot should I need it for an untethered charger. You'll see why later. Along with the cables, I've also got the safety bag from Tesla, and this contains a high-vis jacket, a warning triangle and some first aid items. So the car is packed, is on charge, and it'll be ready for 8 AM tomorrow when I need it. The next thing to do is to plan the journey. Now this route isn't anything new to me, but this time it's different. I'm not just jumping in a petrol car and thinking about a 10-minute petrol stop. I'm thinking, will I make it? Where are the chargers? And how long will this actually take me to complete? So the route is 399 miles each way. Google reckons it'll take me about 6.5 hours, but honestly, most years it takes me around 7 to 8 hours depending on traffic and the toilet breaks along the way. Now a great tool and app for planning your journey is a Better Route Planner. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but it also allows you to put in your car details, your departure time, departure state of charge, your estimated efficiency, and the charges to avoid and various other options as well. It then tells you which chargers you should be using along the way and how long it will take, including the charging stops. So here it reckons it'll take me around 6 hours and 46 minutes, and that's to complete the entire trip with a 30-minute charge at Bristol. Alternatively, you can use the in-car navigation. Simply choose your destination and it'll route you to any chargers along the way. Now this is the easiest way to do it once you're in the car anyway. So here on the in-car screen, it reckons the same journey will take me about 6 hours and 37 minutes, and that's with a 35-minute charge also at the Bristol supercharger. But on the morning of the drive, I did have other plans. I didn't want to stop at Bristol Cribs. I wanted to go further and stop at the Gordano services. I decided to choose this charger as it's closer to family that I plan to meet for lunch. The navigation showed that I would arrive with just 9% battery, but I was going to risk it anyway. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Now, I usually show my battery in percentage rather than miles, but for this journey I'm actually swapping it over to miles instead, and this will give a better indication of how many miles I'm using versus how many miles I'm actually covering. One thing you'll notice which surprised me was a 100% state of charge in my long range Model 3 is now showing only 301 miles. I was expecting to see a little bit more than that. So we got away shortly after 8 AM, and the first thing that I needed to do was to reset the trip. This way I could see how far and how much energy was going to be used on this trip. You just need to swipe right and tap the 3 dots to reset. So our first mile of the journey through Yorkshire's country roads on a typical summer's day, I'll be honest, even though I was anticipating arriving at the first charger with just 9% battery, I had zero range anxiety. I'm not sure if that was me being naive or just blinded by holiday mode. So in an ICE car, you'd look at the fuel range to get an idea of how far you can go, whereas with the Model 3 or any Tesla, you can see the predicted battery or miles using the energy graph. But what's more is, once you've set your destination, the trip graph option is now accessible too. And you can actually see the trip graph to get a real idea of your current journey. So we already know that we should arrive at the Bristol Porter's Head charger with around 9% battery remaining. Throughout the journey, it's worth keeping an eye on this graph, as it will update automatically depending on how you're driving, and it will then give a more accurate estimate of your destination. You'll see how this figure changes over the next 215 miles. So a few things that gets highlighted quite often is whether you should be using the climate control or air conditioning on a long road trip and how efficient that will be. Well, obviously having it off completely will be the most efficient, but who wants to spend 7 hours in a car too hot or too cold just to save a few minutes at a charger? From my understanding, if you have the climate control switched on, it doesn't really matter what you have it set to, you're still using the pump in the battery, so you may as well make yourself comfortable. Speed is another huge factor for efficiency. Ultimately, the slower you drive, the more range you'll get, but again, you've got to be realistic with travel time versus charging time. Do you want to spend an extra hour driving versus charging? So on the way down, I drove at 70 miles per hour just to test out my efficiency. And finally, using cruise control and autopilot will make the journey and your efficiency even better. Motorway driving is perfect for this anyway, and other than the odd lane change, you can cruise along and let the car do the steering, the braking and the accelerating for you. So 100 miles in and the car has lost 117 miles in range. But looking at the trip graph, the projected arrival battery has actually gone up. It's gone up from 9% to 18%. That's awesome. Whereas before I was thinking I might need to stop at another charger beforehand, I've no concerns that I'll make it now. We're approaching Bristol now, my hometown, and as I've set the supercharger as my destination, it would usually start to precondition my battery. But I assume as I've been driving for 3.5 hours now, it doesn't need to do it. But you'll always want to set a supercharger as your destination rather than just driving straight to it, as your battery may need to precondition first. Well, we're now 5 miles from the supercharger with a remaining range of 61 miles. The predicted range is now shown at 20% on arrival. We can also see how busy the stalls are at the supercharger, so I knew at this stage that there were still 2 available upon arrival. So as we pull up, I can see that we've covered 220 miles already today, and we've used 240 miles in range. I mean, that's pretty good going. And as the stalls were pretty busy, when I first plugged in, I was getting a slower speed at charging. I was only getting 200 miles an hour instead of the usual 450 to 500. And this is because if you share a stall with another Tesla, you're actually going to get a slower speed than if you had one to yourself. So if you can, always choose a number that's not in use already. Now the charging limit will also default to 80% at a supercharger, but as I needed the 100%, I did increase this anyway. It predicted the charge would take around 50 minutes, but as this was our first stop of the day, that was enough time for us to use the toilets, grab some lunch and spend some time with family that popped over to see us. If you didn't need to do any of that, we could have just sat in the car and watched Netflix and YouTube or stretched our legs for the hour. Within a few minutes, the car was now charging at 450 miles an hour, as I assume the other Tesla must have left. A quick note, if you do overstay once you finish charging, you can be fined up to 70 pence or $1 per minute. So it's best to increase the battery percentage to 100% just in case, even if you don't need it. And plus the final 10% charge takes ages to complete, and it reduces at one point down to about 50 miles an hour. So 45 minutes later, the car was nearly ready and we headed back to unplug it. And you can see here that the final few miles is actually charging at 46 miles an hour. And this actually slows down to about 10 miles an hour if you leave it long enough. So the session would have cost me about £14.64 or $19, but as I have a few free miles on my account, it didn't cost me anything at all. Now the screen will auto update later to show it was free, but if you're in any doubt, just log into your Tesla account and it will show the cost in the history. So I put the next destination in, which is Carbis Bay, and the final 179 miles, taking us roughly about another 3 hours to do. No stops are needed here, so we should arrive with 27% battery. So the second half of the journey down is my favourite part. It just feels like home, and it instantly puts me in holiday mode. So where are you from? Where are you from in the world, and where do you call home? So we're now nearly 350 miles in, and the arrival state of charge has once again increased from 27% to 35%, which is good to see. I mean, at least it's better than going the opposite way. As we approach the final 10 miles of the journey, we've got loads of battery. A shame the weather wasn't great, but to be honest, this place looks awesome no matter what. We've now arrived with 31% battery or 92 miles of range. We covered exactly 400 miles today, which took us 7.5 hours, including an hour stop for lunch and a charge. That's pretty good going. Efficiency wasn't bad either at 259 watt hours per mile. That's probably the best I'm ever going to see on a steady drive like this. So while staying in Carbis Bay for the next 10 days, I won't have access to charging, unfortunately. There's no charger installed at the property and it's too far from the car to use a 3-pin plug. This means that I will be relying on the public chargers instead. So for the first few days, I didn't move the car at all, and I knew that I was going to be staying local, whether that be on Carbis Bay Beach or walking into St. Ives. But as the week went on, I knew that I was going to be making a few trips out to places like St. Michael's Mount, Penzance and Sennin and various other places as well, so I had to plan my charging ahead. So finding a charger is really straightforward, and I use an app called ZapMap, and I've mentioned this in a previous video as well. It's a free app and it allows you to search for chargers in your area. You can search for the charger type, you can search by the network type, and it allows you to view comments and any photos that previous users have uploaded. And this can be useful as well for locating the charger if it's, say, at the back of a car park or you can't seem to find it when you arrive. So fortunately for me, literally at the bottom of the road where I'm staying, there's the Carbis Bay Hotel, which has 2 destination chargers available. Now, I did message the hotel and they confirmed that the chargers were free to use and open to the public. So one night I drove down and I plugged it in at about 7 p.m. Unfortunately, this was my first iced experience. There were 2 vans in the bays, meaning I couldn't charge the car at all. Now, I did mention this to the bar staff and they very kindly did a call out. And within 10 minutes, both vans moved. And then once I did get plugged in, I was getting around 45 miles an hour, started with a 90 miles of range. I just left it there for a few hours and walked back to the house. Then at around 10:30 p.m, I walked back down to collect the car. It'd been on charge for about 3.5 hours now and was showing a range of 246 miles. And that was completely free. Over the next few days, we travelled around Cornwall, clocking up 200 miles and visiting a few places that we go to regularly. I'll tell you what, you forget how narrow some of these country roads are, these one-track roads. There were many occasions as well where I could hear cars coming around the corner, but they couldn't hear me at all. And these are some of the places that we visited while we were down here. If you're familiar with Cornwall, you may recognise some of these as well. So you've got Mousehole, which is a small fishing port, and it's really, really picturesque as well. Really narrow streets, so if you are going to visit here, it's best to park on the outskirts and walk in instead. Then we headed to Sennin, which is one of the furthest points in England, and it's just walking distance from Land's End, and the views from here are incredible. Now, there is actually a charger at Land's End too, but it's currently out of service according to the comments on ZapMap. Another day we got up really early and we went into St. Ives on the train. It's only £1 each way and takes about 3 minutes. Now, St. Ives is the place that I've always visited every year. If you've been, you'll know why. It's very nostalgic for me. It brings back a load of childhood memories. And if you've ever been down this way, it's definitely a place that I recommend visiting. So a few days later, we went into Penzance, and as I needed to charge the car, I decided to park at Tesco, where SpawnPoiint have recently installed some free chargers. So I parked up, plugged in using the cable, which I obviously store in the front, and left it charging for a few hours while we walked into Penzance. We had some lunch, walked around the harbour, came back, did a bit of shopping at Tesco, and we added 90 miles to the battery, again completely free. So the rest of the week we just stayed local and the car didn't move too much, so we had beach days and we swam in the sea. But one day it was miserable, so we actually decided to go for a drive. And when we set off, we had about 100 miles of range and we drove to Nanjizzle Beach. The weather wasn't great, to be honest, so when we arrived it was absolutely hammering it down, so we just had a picnic in the car, and then when it finally cleared up we did go for a walk just down this dirt track. It's about 1.5 mile walk to the beach and the caves. If you ever do visit Nanjizzle Beach, just be aware there's no car parks, you literally just park at the side of the road and you just find a dirt track with a public footpath sign and you just follow that for 1.5 miles, but it's definitely worth a visit. Now, on the way back, I had about 60 miles of range and I decided to stop off at Asda in Hale for just a quick top-up. Unfortunately, it only has 2 chargers and they were both in use. Now, I know a plug-in hybrid has the ability to use chargers to top up their 30-mile battery, but what's your opinion on them using public chargers? I mean, they have the ability to use petrol or diesel, so they aren't really relying on chargers like a full EV is. Now, I was here for an hour in total, and I waited for about 20 minutes before the Kia moved, and then the Mitsubishi was still there when I left. so I guess they really needed that 30-mile filling up. So our holiday was now coming to an end, and it was time to pack up and head back. Surprisingly, everything packed back into the car first attempt, so that's a first. We were ready to leave around 1 PM, and the navigation predicted that the 399 miles back was going to take us about another 7 hours again, including stops. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have quite enough battery to get me to Gordano services again in Bristol, although I could have taken the car back down to the hotel the night before. I did decide not to. So the navigation was going to take me to Lifton Supercharger, which is about 60 miles away. It's the only one in Cornwall, and I would have been there for about a 35-minute charge is what it recommends, and then on to Hopwood. But again, as I was planning on stopping at the Gordano services to see family, I ignored the advice and did my own thing instead. So I did still select Lifton as my destination. So approaching Lifton, the navigation actually took me the wrong way. It took me behind the hotel and down some country lane and then into a cul-de-sac. I eventually turned the car around and I did find the hotel on the main road instead. And there were actually 10 stalls available, all located at the bottom of the hotel car park. And considering there were no other Tesla superchargers for 100 miles, I was surprised to see it empty. So while charging, I was getting the usual 500 miles an hour. And although it was asking me to charge for 35 minutes, I knew that I wasn't going to be stopping long as I was going to the next supercharger on the route. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I met a new friend on this trip, and here he is. So as you can see, while I was trying to get some footage of the car, this little guy came over, and every shot that I tried to get, he either appeared out of nowhere, or he just continued to follow me around the car park. And at one time, he actually literally ran up to me across the car park and he pecked my ankle. But this was a really nice stop, and had the hotel been open, it would have been the perfect place to eat too. So after 20 minutes or so, I'd charged enough, I said goodbye to my new mate, and we headed north for Bristol. So arriving at Gordano services with 85 miles of range, it meant that I would need around 50 minutes to charge it back up to 100% again. Typically this is not recommended, as the final 10% or so just takes ages, and you're better off doing a 30-minute stop here and then a 20-minute stop later. But as I planned to stop here for lunch anyway, for about an hour to see family, I didn't mind the wait. So while you're charging, you will get a reminder when there's 5 minutes remaining, so you've got plenty of time to get back to the car and move it to prevent any fines. And an hour later, we were at 300 miles and we were ready to leave. So I selected home from the navigation, and the final 280 miles and 3.5 hours to go, it estimated the battery arriving home was going to be about 13%. So we're back on the road. We've eaten, we've got no intention of stopping until we get home now. So we should be back for around 9:30. Now I'm using autopilot most of the time now. It's just so much easier, and it also prevents me from speeding or driving too slowly if I'm not paying attention to my speed. So 30 miles in, and the predicted state of charge has gone from 13% to 27%. That's a huge increase already. So we're about 80 miles and an hour and 20 minutes away from home. We've covered 137 miles, and we've used 154 miles of range since the last charge on this second half of the trip. So not too bad so far. So my experience of using the navigation and the trip graph so far is it definitely overestimates how much energy it thinks that I use, which I obviously prefer, as it means that on every leg of this journey so far, I've arrived with a lot more range than predicted. So it's definitely better this way round than the opposite, and worrying about the battery decreasing too quickly and panicking that I won't make it to my destination. So we're now approaching the final 30 miles of the journey, and we're going to be passing the 1,000 miles mark too for this whole trip. Leaving the motorway now, and we're back onto the Yorkshire country roads for the next half an hour until we get home. In terms of range anxiety, I've had none at all throughout this entire trip. I knew that I had chargers nearby. Even when I was iced and I couldn't charge at the hotel, I wasn't really worried. If I had to be somewhere the next day, or I was desperate for a charge, I could have gone elsewhere. I mean, there was a Genie Point rapid charger at the train station if I wanted to pay, and that would have taken me from about 20 to 80% in about 90 minutes, and it would have cost me around £20. And pulling up at home, we've arrived with just 55 miles of range. There's also a warning on the screen saying that the battery is really low and charging is recommended, so it's a good job that I'm at home. So we've covered a total of 1,031 miles in total, and the first thing I need to do is plug it in for the night, and this is probably the lowest I've ever charged at, so I reckon it's going to take me around 9 hours to charge it back up. So how much did this trip cost me? How much did it cost to cover 1,000 miles? Well, I charged to 100% at home, so that would have cost me around £4 or $5 as I'm with Octopus Go. And by the way, if you use my referral link for Octopus, we'll both get £50 credit just for switching. Then on the journey down, the supercharger cost me nothing at all, and that's thanks to people using my Tesla referral link. Then while I was travelling around, I only used the free public chargers, including the Tesla destination and the SpawnPoiint chargers. And finally, on the way home, the superchargers also cost me nothing. So all in all, it literally cost me £4 or $5 to cover 1,000 miles. Compare that to a petrol car, one that can say do 50 miles per gallon. That would have cost me £118 and $160 in petrol, or like my last car, one that can do 25 miles per gallon, and that would have cost me £235 or $315 to do the same trip. Now, if I had to pay for supercharging, it would have cost me around £46 or $60 to use those. The destination charging would have cost me about £20 in parking if I needed to use it during the day, but the other stops were free regardless. So I guess this 1,000 mile road trip could have cost me about £70 or $93 worst case, but it didn't. It cost me £4. I actually want to say a massive thank you though to the people that are using my referral link. I couldn't have got free charging without you. And every person who uses my referral link to buy a Tesla, we both get 1,000 free miles added to our account, and that's valid for 6 months. I might even cover this in a future video as well if you're interested. Finally, after 10 days worth of sea and sand, the car looked a mess. And if you've ever taken your car to the beach, you'll know what I'm talking about. Sand just gets everywhere. And I made no attempt at keeping the car clean while I was away. But the next morning, there was no delay in cleaning the inside and trying to get rid of every grain of sand. And this is what it looks like now. So the outside still needs a clean, but it started to rain shortly after doing this, so there was no time to do it today. Now, would I do anything different next time? Probably not. It took me about 7 to 8 hours each way to cover the 400 miles, which included charging and lunch, and we would have stopped for that anyway. So driving the car was easy and it was pretty fun. It's a really nice place to be. Now, I didn't feature my wife and children in this video, but they loved the trip. It was probably the best trip that I've ever made from York to Cornwall. And if you've made it this far, thank you, honestly. There's probably not many of you, so thank you for listening and watching this video right to the end. I mean, I knew this was going to be a long video, but this is definitely the longest video that I've ever created. But what do you think, honestly? Are you surprised by anything? Did it look easy or too much effort to take a trip like this in a Tesla? And what's the longest road trip that you've ever done in a car? That wraps up this week's video. And if you've got any questions at all or suggestions for a future video, just drop them in the comments and I will get back to you. And as always, thank you for watching. And if this video was useful to you or you're interested in seeing more Tesla and tech videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also follow me on my other social channels, including Instagram and Twitter. Until next time.